Thanks for watching How to Build a Motorcycle Part 4. In Part 3, we discussed the drivetrain, the electrical system, and the ignition system. In Part 4, we're going to do an assembly. As I've discussed in the previous videos, I'm not a professional speaker, and I will stumble over some words and sentences. That's because I'm reading from information we created here at CustomChoppersGuide.com. But I think you'll find it helpful. With all the parts assembled, the chopper needs a complete build-up to make sure everything fits, to make adjustments, and to drill the final fitments and attachment points. And then it needs taking to pieces again to paint and finish. This will probably be the only full build-up, but you will have assembled parts of the bike before. Obviously, at this stage, you don't need to do the wiring and plumbing, but you might want to check these parts for size. Just like in Part 1, the frame building video series you can get at CustomChoppersGuide.com. There are many different ways to go about the assembly. Here I'll run through just one way, but one that seems fairly intuitive to a beginner builder. Basically, I'll start with the frame, add the forks, front wheel, engine, transmission, etc., the rear wheel, the metalwork, the seat, and the handlebars. With the unpainted but otherwise finished frame and your forks of choice, you can begin. You will need a working surface that is flat and true, and perhaps a solid mechanism for holding the front wheel in place. A chopper workshop will have an adjustable height bench and with a large wheel, clamp, or vise for this purpose. Alternatively, you can block up the frame to ride height and then strap it very securely blocked up to ride height, measured above the working surface, not from the floor. In this second case, you'll be able to fit the front wheel to the forks hanging out in space. Make sure the setup is solid, however. They can be homemade and improvised, the main thing being a good, true surface and some way to be sure that the heavy machine will not fall on you. The forks, having been specified for the frame as discussed earlier, are very easy to fit together. You can add waterproof grease at this stage or in the final assembly. The triple tree sections above and below the neck need to be put into place, usually by dropping the upper bearing into the neck, then connecting the lower triple tree, all of which can be then tightened using the Allen key bolt or whatever. With the forks in place, the front wheel, with tire on and inflated, should be put in place. The front rotor or rotors should already be on the wheel so we can fit the calipers later. The rotors just bolt into place on the wheel. Once the wheel and forks are on the frame, the bike can be put in place. If you're using a front wheel vise, it will stand upright and in an approximate riding position. It's a good idea to block it up to riding height at this stage. Next is the engine. The engine is heavy, so putting it in place is a two-man job. It's safer this way. Hopefully the engine mounts upon which it sits, two of the three mounts we just described earlier, the ones near the base of the frame, will be in exactly the right place for you now to bolt the engine in place. There will be a pair of bolts at the front where the down tubes end and probably two more behind the engine where the center post drops. Don't tighten them right up at this stage. Any problems can be addressed at this stage. This is the point of the mock-up. But obviously, don't keep weakening the mounting by drilling and so on. Generally, it's better to get the right mounting plate and start again. The top support we will need to mark and drill before bolting. This will do when we've fitted the other large parts to the frame. You'll have bought the engine and transmission to match as discussed, so the transmission simply needs placing and bolting to the transmission mounts. Hopefully this too will bolt happily into place. Place the belt or chain that will provide the drive from the transmission to the rear wheel before adding the inner primary, or you won't be able to put it on. This is the point at which we align the transmission and the engine and make sure the offset is correct to reach the rear wheel drive. The offset is what allows the belt to clear the tire of whatever dimension we've chosen. Other options we've discussed include using a transmission with a final drive on the right-hand side. Here we're considering a left-hand side final drive on a transmission engine configuration that is only connected through the primary. On TC88s, the whole thing is bolted together, which means moving everything, engine and transmission as one. Check there is sufficient clearance between the frame and the transmission to allow the belt to run freely. Any problems can be addressed with shims beneath the transmission where it attaches to the frame. The exact offset you need depends on the size of the rear wheel and the exact transmission, engine, and frame combination. Spacers are usually used between the engine and the inner primary. They match the shape of the large circle the engine forms around the moving wheel, and the inner primary is bolted straight through them into the engine block. At this point, you will have a roughly oval inner with two shafts poking through, one from the engine and a second from the transmission. The next thing to do is to somehow connect the power of the engine with the control offered by the transmission. Aside from the two shafts that are showing, there is also an obvious hole up to the top right as you look directly at the inner primary. This is where the starter will push out. The starter itself sits on the other side of the inner primary. Install it and then lubricate and slide into place the jack shaft, which is the part that sticks through the inner primary. Onto this, slide the outer coupling, the drive, the cogwheel, and screw it into place with the supplied long bolt. Now we're ready to add the primary drive wheel beside the engine and the clutch beside the transmission. As we've already discussed, the connection will be made by either a chain or a belt. The only thing to remember is that the big wheel, the main shaft, has a left-hand thread because otherwise it will come undone when everything is turning. When you have the wheels in place, adjust the tension in the belt or chain as recommended in the accompanying documentation. For example, a rear drive might require 5/8 of an inch play in the chain when the engine is cold. To set this, you just hold a steel rule somewhere near the center of the chain and push the chain upwards with your finger. You'll be able to measure how much it moves. This is the play. When the tension is right, you can screw on the outer if you want. It's not essential in the mock-up, but it looks nice. At this point, with everything in place and tightened, we can place the motor mount at the top and mark the frame mount for drilling. Don't drill it until after everything has been installed though, since you may need to change things, and it's not necessary to have the engine fixed at all 3 points during the mock-up. The goal of the rear wheel is that it sits in the middle of the frame and runs straight. This is complicated by the rotor on one side and the pulley and the belt or chain on the other. You would have immediate problems if this combination didn't fit in the frame, but this isn't likely to happen if you've done your planning. In fact, there should be plenty of space, and the trick is to use spacers to get the positioning you need. On the right-hand side of the rear wheel, we want to put a spacer next to the rotor to allow clearance for the brake caliper bracket. You can get the rotor in the right place by placing a metal rule between the rotor and the tire. It will be snug against the widest part of the tire at both sides, and then you can slide the rotor up to the metal rule. You can use a spacer here to get it right before putting the wheel on the bike. A spacer on this side of the rotor needs to be in the same pattern as the rotor, so if the rotor has 5 bolt holes, the spacer needs 5 bolt holes and the same internal diameter. Put the wheel in place on the frame, fitting the belt to the pulley on the left-hand side. Here you want the belt to be close to the outer edge of the tire whilst clearing it. When in place on the bike, the axle spacer on the left-hand side of the bike should protrude by, say, 1/8 of an inch. Now what remains on the right is the axle spacer and probably a gap. This gap needs to be filled with a spacer. All these spacers can be homemade, but given you need to purchase metal in reasonably large quantities, you're usually better off buying them. The final spacer fits between the caliper and the axle spacer. The order usually is, therefore, wheel, rotor, spacer, caliper, spacer, axle, spacer, frame, nut. Now the assembly can be tightened with the belt brought to operating tightness and the wheel centered. Use a long rule or a straight edge to run down the back of the bike from the neck along the center and beyond the wheel. This will let you see exactly how good your wheel centering has been. There are also simple alignment tools available, which are really just appropriately bent pieces of metal. If you now block the bike up a little further, you can roll the wheel and watch the belt. What is essential here is that the belt tracks smoothly and centrally on the pulley. If it doesn't, it isn't going to work very well. If you have a problem, it can be with the alignment of the wheel and the transmission. Try altering the spacer configuration or checking the transmission is not at an angle, or with the wheel not being in straight on the frame. Now, if you want, you can fit the front and rear calipers. They just need bolting on with extra care being taken to ensure that the split in the caliper is dead center over the rotor. This almost always requires some fine tuning, which is why most calipers come with shims as well as mounting bolts. That must be bolts, good bolts, grade 8 as we discussed in the previous videos. The bike is now looking like something, even though we're missing many of the things that will make it go, such as electrics and fuel, somewhere to sit, something to steer it with, and any usable human controls. It's a good idea now to fit the fuel tank and any other things like fenders that will attach to the bits we've now assembled. Although we have some kind of attachments in mind for the gas tank, it's likely that the final fitting will need some extra work. This could involve cutting a piece of tubing or piping. The difference is less important here than in building the frame. So the flat strap that will be bolted onto the gas tank can be fitted exactly, then welded onto the frame itself. It's just as easy to have done this early on, of course. The tank will also need marking out for any other drill holes on the other attachment points on the frame, usually on the top engine mount. The tank will be fastened with some rubber spacers when finally put in place. The fenders will need to be drilled down, however, because this is the first time the wheels have been in place. A regular spacing is needed between the tire and the fender, and this is achieved by taping something to the tire and resting the fender on while marking out. Many builders use an old belt from the belt drive here, since that happens to offer about ½ an inch. This is also an opportunity to fabricate other struts and supports for the fenders if you want. The mock-up is already largely finished. Adding the handlebars and seat just make it look more finished. Potentially, there could be some final fitting issues, so you can do things like check the clearance height, check that the bars won't smash into the gas tank if they overshoot the stops, as they could do if the bike falls over. Think about where you plan to route the electrics. Admire it. Then take it to pieces again. Paint it, remembering to mask the engine mounts where a metal-to-metal contact will be needed, and the other sections as well, where they are on the earth. For example, rebuild it and write it. I want to thank you for watching How to Build a Motorcycle, parts 1 through 4, and if you'd like more tips and information, please go to customchoppersguide.com and get our free bike building mini course. It's totally free, and it's very effective in terms of building your knowledge and giving you exact tips and techniques to avoid and to cover as you build your bike. In addition, I recommend this DVD called Build Your Own Bike. It's actually quite phenomenal. It's the only and the best DVD, 2 DVDs in one, on how to build a motorcycle from the ground up, not including the frame, of course. And when you buy it from us at customchoppersguide.com, you get a free bonus ebook called Chopper Frame Alignment: How to Get Your Frame Straight, which is one of the many frustrations builders encounter as they build their frame. Getting a lot of good feedback on that special ebook alone. So it's well worth your time and money to build your own bike, but at least get the free mini course called Costly Mistakes Motorcycle Builders Make and How to Avoid Them. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.